Hello, everybody. We're continuing our series of interviews with leading innovation expert, and this time we're interviewing Dr. Stephen Tang on leading through crises and embracing innovation in the process of doing so. He originally earned a PhD in chemical engineering and later added an MBA from Wharton, and he has a long and storied career spanning over 3 decades. He's been an entrepreneur, consultant, corporate executive, board professional, and a lot more. But with that, I'll let you take it from here. So could you please give a quick introduction of yourself and your background?
Jesse, it's a pleasure to be here with you and your innovation audience. Very close and near to dear to my heart for many years. I am an American, but I'm the son of immigrants. My parents fled war-torn China after World War II to make a new home here in America. Um, my father is a fellow PhD chemical engineer, my late father. My mother is a scientist, and so I grew up in a very sciencey, engineering-y, higher education-y kind of environment. But I say that not to be highbrow and inaccessible. I just think it's the curiosity and the search for knowledge and the linking of disciplines together was key to my upbringing. And as the son of immigrants, a person of color, I would say I very much was used to growing up as an outsider, and that's shaped my perspective, both as an innovator and an entrepreneur. Um, I'm a great believer that the immigrants' pathway in their new country is very closely aligned with the innovator and the entrepreneur's pathway, trying to break new ground and new areas and doing the unexpected. So all those things have shaped my perspective and worldview. And your very generous introduction, I think, highlights the fact that I've been fortunate to be in leadership roles for many years in my career since graduating college with a degree in chemistry before the PhD in chemical engineering and the MBA from Wharton started 40 years ago. I say that with a deep sigh for so many years, but I've been fortunate that over those 40 years, I've served as in the CEO role, the chairman or the founder owner role for 33 of those combined years. And that spans a number of industries, from professional services, management consulting specifically. I was an energy technology entrepreneur and spent a lot of years in the life science industry as an entrepreneur, supporting entrepreneurs through a nonprofit, and then actually being on the front line and the firing line in the arena, so to speak, as an entrepreneur myself. So I see the world clearly from the view of a decision maker and from a corporate governance perspective. And I think a lot about how my life's experiences have impacted my view of innovation and what innovators can do to advocate for their own cause, but understand how decision makers think of things.
Perfect. Thanks for the background and introduction. I think that's a perfect place for us to jump on, and I think I'd like to start off with quite a tough question for you. So you've obviously spent a lot of time leading innovation in the corporate world, and oftentimes we hear how difficult it is and how so many companies are failing at it. So why do you think it's so challenging for most organizations?
Well, I go to a fundamental definition, Jesse, of strategy, which I think has long been glorified. Resource intensive, expensive exercises, strategy formulation for companies. I would boil it down to this, though. The strategy is the overlap of opportunities and capabilities. Okay. And so I think if anybody in a company views strategy in that way, then you're thinking already in terms of an innovator's world, right? Innovators think of what can I do well and what does the world need and how do we make money off of it, right? So that simple confluence, I think, sets the stage for how innovators can align with corporate executives. You have to be able to speak a common language. And I think that strategy as opportunity overlapping capability makes a lot of sense. Now, it's not a static analysis, right? Our capabilities change over times and our opportunities change over times. And we'll get into it a little later, I'm sure. But I am predicting that the next normal for all of us will be filled with crises that we're going to have to adjust to. So I think pre-pandemic strategy was viewed more as, gospel and immutable. And post-pandemic, where we are today and moving into the next normal, it'll have to be much more flexible. So if innovators could speak that language of strategy and speak in terms of how our capabilities are changing, what we need for investment, and how the opportunities are shifting, greater or smaller over time, I think we'd all have better harmony and alignment towards the strategy and towards the execution of it.
Hmm. Awesome. That's a great summary. Um, I know that you struggled with many of these changes during your time at OraSure during the pandemic. Given given your background in experiencing these really firsthand, could you share like what you went through during that time and how you were thinking about and leading the company during that sort of like quite a tumultuous time?
Well, I appreciate that. I'll try to give you answers in bite-sized chunks. As you know, Jesse, I've written a book
Yeah.
called A Test for Our Time,
Mhm.
which is an account, a memoir with a lot of lessons about what it's like to lead a company during a pandemic. So just a brief background. OraSure Technologies was founded 35 years ago. It went public 20 years ago. And the pandemic really focused our attention, and by the way, our strategy, which meant opportunities and capabilities, on creating an in-home COVID-19 test, and that's what this is right here. So, IntelliSwab, which Oprah Winfrey graciously said is the easiest home COVID-19 test to use in America, was our great breakthrough product. We also do other things. There's a company in the States called 23andMe, and they make DNA tests, and we also make the saliva collection kit to go with that test. So we had latent capability, and the company was an innovator throughout its existence. It actually developed the first in-home HIV test that hit the market in 2012. And oddly, between 2012 and the pandemic in 2020, there were no other home tests that the FDA approved for infectious diseases. Okay, and so we had latent capability, but a fairly limited market. So the story of OraSure is how we became a company that in our entire 20-year public company existence sold about 80 million tests, most of those HIV tests, to ramping up to be able to produce IntelliSwab at the rate of 100 million tests per year. So think of that. Before the pandemic, you were in a company that sold 80 million tests over its 20-year existence. And then right now, if you're working for OraSure, you're working for a company that sells more than that every single year. So the breakthrough in innovation was first discovering the product, then
Mhm.
reducing it to practice, and then scaling it up massively, which required not only the scale up of physical facilities and machinery, but capability as well. So all that done in our backdrop, as we all know, of a dangerous pandemic where many
Yeah.
people were isolated at home. Those that came into the facilities had to be protected. So you
Mhm.
have that very strange dichotomy and paradox, where before the pandemic, most people would have said that could not be done because you have to have innovation that fosters bringing people together before they can actually create products on a massive scale. So there are some interesting lessons that we learned that all of us, I think, as leaders had to address as we went along. There was no textbook for managing a pandemic and a crisis in this particular way. So it was both delightful and satisfying and terrifying at times.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Um, if we start from the beginning, kind of like what was something that kind of like when you first when the pandemic first began, how did you pull the team together? What were you thinking about, and how did you kind of like start the transformation?
Well, I think it's, one of the most misunderstood things about innovation, Jesse, as I think you and your audience knows, is that most of the world believes that innovation happens with an Archimedes type moment. Eureka, we found it, right? And in fact, it's a lot of hard work over a long period of time that most people don't see. And in the case of OraSure, I credit our diagnostics R&D team, led by Dr. Jody Berry, who's a very talented immunologist, Canadian by background. He and his team had scoured the literature to know what this particular SARS-CoV-2 virus was all about and how it was going to be different than previous SARS viruses, and then successfully made the case to decision makers, including myself, that this was something we should pursue. It would be a game changer, even though it wasn't in our existing strategy or in existing budgets. Okay,
Mhm.
so that challenge in its own right has several dimensions. There's a scientific dimension to it. So, in the words of Mark Watney, the astronaut from The Martian, we knew we had to science the shit out of this, right? But he also had to convince decision makers like myself that we needed to pivot our time, attention, and our budgets into something else. So all those things together sort of laid the groundwork for how we began. And there were many twists and turns, one of which was we both thought in the beginning that the test was going to be using saliva as the method of detecting the virus, but the coronavirus wouldn't cooperate. Coronavirus wants to exist in the nose, and we had to pivot into a test that included a nasal swab in our product to be able to sample there. So there's a lot of room to talk about the unexpected and the unforeseen and what actually happened, and to be able to pivot and adjust to all those issues, both technical, um, managerial, and also political and social, that happened throughout the crisis.
Absolutely. Um, if I kind of like then I'd like to dive a little deeper on that and kind of like then think about all of those challenges that you had to overcome. In hindsight, what do you think were some of the biggest ones that you didn't or you weren't kind of like expecting?
Well, there were certainly technical challenges, as I mentioned, but
Hmm.
we were dealing with a regulatory body, the FDA, which was operating under emergency use authorization versus their standard way of approving products. So they were essentially developing those as they went along also. So if you go back to strategy being capability over opportunity, the opportunity remained large, but the capability to get to that opportunity shifted very much over time because everybody was trying to make adjustments to the pandemic.
Hmm.
Um, that and if you remember the way that leaders around the world were communicating about the virus, um, not one of them had it right from the outset, and most of them
Yeah.
had it wrong on a continuing basis. And so, how to get people focused on the task at hand without being distracted by what was going on the outside. I remember early on, as we were making the decisions, there was a healthy dose of people that believed this was going to pass quickly and that we shouldn't devote our time and attention to it. So
Mm.
what leaders and innovators have to do is make sense of a very complicated world with a lot of information that is conflicting along the way. And then I think lastly, scaling this up in a manufacturing environment, we had to make the investments to prepare the facilities, to create the facilities, to order the machines and equipments and the automation lines well ahead of knowing whether we could actually do this well. And so there was a risk of doing that as well. There's the usual scale up challenges that you face to bring a product to the market, not the
Mm.
least of which this massive scale. Remember, company from 80 million tests over 20 years to 100 million tests a year every single year. Um, so where do we start? There were challenges throughout that entire process. And the organization had to respond by scaling up its capabilities from R&D to the quality functions, to the regulatory functions, to the clinical testing
Hmm.
functions, all the way to manufacturing and then marketing and beyond. So you see that ripple effect throughout the organization where everybody had to do their job and be aligned in terms of timing and purpose along the way. So
Hmm.
I think it's a challenge, probably, once in a lifetime, once in a generation for all of us. And I think the important thing is those of us that went through it have to acknowledge what went right and what went wrong and what could have gone better to
Mm.
prepare ourselves for future challenges.
Mm. It's a great place to step to a slightly different topic. I'd like to return to the practical side of innovation a little later, but I think I'd like to touch a little bit about a little on your book. You mentioned that it's about leadership during a crisis and kind of like the new normal and how to approach all of that. So what's sort of like your main thesis behind the book, and how would you kind of like summarize your main learnings?
Well, I think there are several lessons, but this ends up being a profoundly human story. Okay,
Mm.
it is about strategy, it's about products, it's about the pandemic, but it's really about people.
Mm.
And the biggest learning for me was that as a leader, we need to lead whole people wholeheartedly. And that is, we cannot assume that people come into their jobs and can focus on their jobs when they have so many other things going on in their life. And the pandemic brought that to the front and center. We had people working with their spouses who may have also been working with children who were attending school remotely, all in one building, their home, 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for over 2 years now. So I think leaders should take note of that. To get people to work together, they first have to acknowledge that those people have challenges in their own lives. So that's the whole people part of it. The wholehearted part of it is comes down to the basic trust formula, which I learned many years ago when I was with Gemini Consulting, and that is trust is equal to credibility times intimacy divided by risk. So let me unpack that. So at any given moment, credibility means there's no gap between what you say and what you do. Right? I believe you. I trust you because you're capable of doing it. Intimacy is I trust you because you have my back. Right? And in cases where you have profound risk during a pandemic, that's the denominator risk. So if risk is high, that means that credibility and intimacy have to be equally high to maintain the same level of trust. So what that means fundamentally is people have to believe that you care about them before they'll care about the cause. And so much has been written about organizations having purpose and mission, but I think at a very human, personal level, leaders have to make sure that their people believe that their leaders have their best interests, their health and their safety first, before they will commit to working harder on risky projects that may not have the outcomes in the time that we think they will. So fundamentally, that's what it means. So it's about compassion, but it's also about accountability and empowerment and engagement. So I think the very counterintuitive part of the leadership equation here is that in order to get people to work together well in many different locations, whether they're remote or they're in the office or they're in a laboratory or in the manufacturing facility, you need to empower them. You need to give them the information they can to make the decisions as quickly as possible, as best as possible, to get them there. And there's so many analogies I think of in military environments where that's been the difference. If you look at space exploration, you look at the Apollo 13 crisis, you look at the way we portray science fiction movies, what it really comes down to is you need to trust people to do their best for you. And the best way
Hmm.
to do that is to show is to earn the respect and trust of them in times of crisis. So that's a lot to unpack there, but that's fundamentally what we learned through the crisis.
Yeah, and even though that was about leadership, I think the people aspect is so important in all of innovation. You are innovating with people and for people, so you can't really just forget about all of that and just try to focus on the subject at hand. But need to
I agree.
take a broader perspective. If we then take that and dive deeper on innovation specifically. So you were already talking about making the case to executives, and I think that's a big challenge that a lot of our audience is intimately familiar with, sometimes successfully and sometimes not so successfully. So can you kind of like, as someone who's seen pitches, and I'm sure you have your fair share of given your fair share of rejections for these innovative proposals as well. So kind of like, what's your take on that, and how would you advise these people on how to make their point so that it gets through?
Well, we're in a very strange time, Jesse. As you know, there are many crises that are upon us. I'm a believer that the pandemic is not yet over. In the northern hemisphere, we're entering winter as we speak here. We're not sure what will happen here, and so we should all be cautious. We have a global economic crisis. We have a war in Europe. We have an energy crisis in Europe. Many things factor into uncertainty, and I think as been said often, business craves predictability, and we don't have predictability right now. And so leaders left in uncertainty and ambiguity will tend to try to control the situation as much as possible, and they do that typically through budgets, right? So it really causes leaders in innovation and those promoting and advocating innovative projects to really sharpen their pencil in their approach. So I think the reality of the situation right now is that if you're looking at opportunities overlapping capability, if you're asking leaders to invest in capabilities that have a longer term horizon, that's going to be less likely to happen just because they're going to be
Mm.
very short term focus and looking at preserving resources. Okay. If you happen to work for a company that's a bit more progressive in their thinking and have the resources to invest, you can take a different approach though, which says that this is a sound use of investment under the following scenarios. But I think that leaders always appreciate proposals that have contingency plans behind them. All right. So in contrast to here's my one answer, take it or leave it. In times of uncertainty and ambiguity, it's good to have a portfolio of options. Okay. And because things could change for the better or worse very quickly these days, I think it's very important that you cultivate a relationship with the decision makers, which gives them value over time. So I'll go back to my example of how my R&D team in diagnostics were sort of the early warning system about SARS-CoV-2 and how it was going to be different than other SARS virus. Be that source of information to inform your decision makers and keep them on top of their game so they can help you stay on top of your game. I think that's the kind of exchange and kind of approach that I would recommend.
Yeah, taking a more longer term approach and earning that trust, like you were just talking about earlier. So
Yes. Yes.
awesome. Well, if you then kind of like think about the practical challenges in trying to get these kinds of challenging projects to completion and creating that value during such times of crisis. I mean, what are some of the lessons that you might have learned on that along the years?
Well, I think it's going to be an interesting portfolio of projects that makers will look at. And so it's not a
Mm.
static view of just the breakthrough products or services. I think that's too narrow a view of where innovation is going to happen.
Mm.
If you look at just the supply chain challenges today and the assumptions that were made before the pandemic, when everybody was focused on just in time, with very little slack or contingency in the supply chain. Now that's being completely rethought, right? The crisis in the Suez Canal in March of 2021, I think, was indicative of it's emblematic of how things can go wrong quickly and affect so many people. So I think the call for innovation is going to come from across organizations, not just from R&D and not just from people wearing white lab coats. it's going to be throughout the businesses. And so I think there's a reawakening of what innovation means to an enterprise, from purchasing to manufacturing to fulfillment. That supply chain needs to be closely watched. The opportunities for automation, the opportunities for contingency planning are there as well. So I think there ought to be, from a decision maker's perspective, competition in the organization for innovation across the enterprise.
Mhm.
And I think that's a healthy thing for everybody. Those that are in product development, I think, need to be aware of that, because I think that's the way decision makers will be thinking these days.
Mhm. Mhm. And if you think about that in terms of like, should the R&D or innovation teams or units, should they also be thinking about the bigger picture and contributing proactively towards these other areas of the business, or how do you see the relationship between innovation and or R&D and the other teams?
Well, in times of crises, in times of uncertainty and ambiguity, decision makers like to see risk distributed, right? And so they
Mhm.
don't like all in, kind of decisions. And so those in the R&D environment who work closely with corporate development and business development, I think, will have an advantage. In other words, if you cultivated ways of partnership and alliances um, before the pandemic, and can leverage those now going forward into this next normal, which is going to be crisis laden, I think you're going to be much better off. And so the degree of sharing risk throughout the process, I think, will serve product developers and folks in R&D well. And that includes, working with universities or other nonprofit entities that have capability that you don't have, and where you can make the case for investment outside of your organization rather than bringing on staff. That sounds much more flexible to decision makers.
Mm.
The ability to partner with other industry partners is going to be important as well. And so it's really going to rely on the resourcefulness, I think, of the R&D personnel to help make the case for this kind of flexible investment over time.
Right, right. Makes sense. Um, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and touch upon a recent blog post that I see you've written about unknown and its relationship between ambiguity and how these really affect the businesses. And I found the topic to really struck a chord with me, and I think there's something that every innovator that is trying to create new things, and every leader that is looking to steer the organization towards a slightly unknown future. I mean, we're all really familiar with those challenges. So, what's kind of like your take on that, and how would you kind of like think about the roles of ambiguity, uncertainty, and how you as a leader or as an innovator should approach these and sort of like balance the equation?
Well, I think it begins at the top. Okay, so you have to look at how the process of approving strategies and budgets actually happens. Okay, and in a quieter period of time, you could look ahead and have a budget over 12 months, and you could have a strategic plan for 5 years away that was meaningful. These days, with high ambiguity and uncertainty and lots of unforeseen circumstances, that may not even be possible. It may not even be worth the investment to do that with things shifting so quickly.
Mhm.
So I think if you begin at the top, then the top executives have to work with the governance of their organization, their board of directors, for example, and come up with a flexible way of allocating resources. And maybe it's only quarterly, maybe it's less than quarterly, maybe it's monthly. But you have to have that agreement in place. If you don't have that agreement in place, it's very likely there'll be disconnects between what was forecasted over a time horizon which was unreasonable and the
Mm.
results you're actually going to get. Okay,
Yeah.
so I think that step from top executives gives their organization much more flexibility. And again, it goes to the trust equation. So if I know my CEO has my back, and that yeah, he's invested in me because he knows and trusts my capability, then you have a high degree of alignment and you can do great things together.
Hmm.
And so I think that's where I would focus on, and I think there are some courageous leaders out there who are able to do that. The tricky thing is when you are a public company and you're reporting quarterly earnings, right? There's some mythology to these days that somehow, because you can declare a number a quarter out, that you know more than the market does. And the reality of it is, nobody knows more than the market and the circumstances are today, and it
Hmm.
almost requires that flexibility from decision makers. So that's
Hmm.
that's a place I would focus on.
Hmm. That's a really sage advice in kind of like just keeping that flexibility and just like you mentioned earlier about the supply chains and creating a bit more anti-fragility, I would say, towards that, than having the same in governance and remaining flexible there.
Yeah, I love that concept of anti-fragility,
Mm.
which things become stronger under stress.
Yeah.
That's why our bones get stronger with exercise, right? That's why companies like OraSure got stronger during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So those are shining examples, I think, that we need to bring more awareness, shine a stronger light on, so that people
Mm.
see how that actually works. Because I think that the tendency is to focus just on resiliency, which is don't lose anything, but not understand that you can get stronger during crises, during stress. Um, and so I think it's a mind shift change that we collectively need about that.
Hmm. Awesome. I've got a couple more topics left before we wrap up. I wanted to also hear about your take on culture and creating an environment where innovation thrives. We've obviously touched on this a little bit already, but would you have any practical advice or any sort of like tangible takeaways? Because often culture seems to be this, super ambiguous and difficult thing to really shape. So any practical advice for our listeners?
Well, I'm a fan of Victor Wong's book, The Rainforest, which was published 10 years ago. And he says many things in the book, but focused on the culture piece. Um, Organizers of innovation cultures or innovation ecosystems. So that can be a community, and I've worked as a community activist and organizer in Philadelphia to create an innovation ecosystem there through the University City Science Center. I did that for 10 years, but I think the same principles can be applied to corporate culture as well, which is you have to view innovation as a rainforest and
Mm.
invite the biodiversity that's required in a rainforest to create lush life and vibrancy. Okay. Now, it's not all to the good, because if you go down to the Amazon, the rainforest there, and bats and there are exotic birds. As a promoter of an innovation culture, I think you have to have a certain tolerance for those elements. Okay. And I think this is where a lot of companies get it wrong, is that they try to homogenize the culture and really don't allow for the quirkiness of innovators who might be outliers, outsiders, if you
Mm.
will, to be able to contribute to the mission of the company. And so I think as decision makers, we have to recognize that there ought to be a tolerance, which means that you're always going to have situations where somebody doesn't like somebody, that somebody thinks that somebody's doing something that the wrong way. But to have some tolerance for that, and be able to have a connection with all those people without bias to the way we're used to doing things. Okay, so there
Mm.
has to be a good balance between building new capabilities and new perspectives, which is a diversity piece, and recognition of the strength of our tradition. And
Mm.
sometimes those elements are at odds with each other. But if you're really going to promote innovation, I think you need to be very conscious of that and promote and advance the diversity piece of it.
Awesome. I think we're getting close to the end of this session. So any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our fellow innovators and innovation leaders? What to really focus and take away from our discussion today?
Well, I think, Jesse, we've covered a lot of ground. I think that at the heart of innovation is to be able to sense the world and make sense of the world today and where it's going. Um, and I hope we as a society never lose that thirst and that interest of doing so. And I think that we're going to have to confront many more crises in the next normal. And so that will create opportunity on a rolling basis for those that see the opportunity, can focus on it, can resource it, and can accomplish it. But all those things I think are wrapped up in this notion of ambiguity and uncertainty. Okay, so it'll be a profound leadership test going forward to bring all these
Mm.
elements together. But it's not a hypothetical exercise. Um, this leadership is involves earning the trust of others, earning the respect of others. So I come back
Yeah,
to the trust formula. Trust is equal to credibility times intimacy divided by risk. So you got to have people's back, and you have to um, have no gap between what you do and what you say, or what you expect them to do and say as well. And ultimately, it comes down to leading whole people wholeheartedly. And if you promote accountability, compassion, empowerment, and engagement, you'll have an innovative culture, you'll have an innovative company that is truly anti fragile, gets stronger with the stress over time.
perfect. That's the perfect place to wrap up on. Thank you so much for coming on, Stephen. And we'll leave links to your upcoming book and some of the other resources for our listeners to check out later. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jesse. Pleasure to be with you.